Are you familiar with the 6 levels of entrepreneurship? They're all fulfilling, all meaningful, and all yield profit, just in different ways. You can tailor them to your own desired experience.
This is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast. Entrepreneurs are economic heroes. They improve others' lives with preferred products and services, innovation, and value. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one by building a beautiful business. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. The ecosystem of entrepreneurship can be viewed through the lens of the individual and through the lens of the economy or society, the micro view and the macro view. The macro view is one of growth, dynamism, civilizational advance, and social betterment. How so? Here's how that ecosystem works. Entrepreneurship is both creative and coordinating. It's creative in that entrepreneurs are the ones who discover or create what's new. It is new discoveries that move us all forward to a better place. That new contribution could be a medicine or a therapy that extends life, or it could be a new food recipe that both tastes good and is good for you. Or it could be a new social media feature that makes us feel better online. Or it could be a new execution of 3D printing that makes manufacturing faster and more efficient. Creative entrepreneurship is the source of these breakthroughs and these improvements. The coordination function is just as important. How does society come to a consensus on the highest and best use of its resources? Through entrepreneurship. Individual A saves and transmits the savings to individual B, someone like Charles Schwab perhaps, who looks for the highest and best investment use for those savings, which eventually find their way to an entrepreneur seeking to assemble new capital for a new innovation. That's one form of coordination. Or entrepreneur X hears consumer Y express a dissatisfaction and develops a new solution to address it. That's another form of coordination. Many more consumers prove willing to pay a price for that new solution, and that results in a profit for the entrepreneur, signaling that all of those consumers, let's call them society, approve of this use of resources and want the entrepreneur to continue producing. That's another form of coordination. This creative and coordinating function of entrepreneurship never stops, never ends, and it never stays the same. There's always more newness to be created and more coordination to be improved. Entrepreneurship is the dynamic component, the vital energy of human life. And it never stops. There are no boundaries at the micro level, the level of the individual entrepreneur. The entrepreneur who coordinates by opening a new store in the neighborhood to serve immediate local needs is just as much a creative coordinating force as the billionaire founder of the largest online retailer. The accounting firm, the legal firm, and the marketing agency are as creative and coordinating as Google or Uber. Every entrepreneurial life is a journey to purpose and meaning, and that journey benefits the individual as much as it benefits society. Our guest today, Stephen Phelan, has performed the service of collating and illustrating and analyzing all the possible journeys. He's talked to entrepreneurs one-on-one, that's the micro level, and he's analyzed trends and data and outcomes, that's the macro level, and put them all together in a book called Startup Stories. Steve is Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship at Fayetteville State University, part of the UNC system, and he's led Centers of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at a number of universities. Steve, welcome to Economics for Entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Hunter. Thanks for having me back.
Well, today we're going to talk about a new book that you have recently published called Startup Stories. And as background to that, you've been an entrepreneur, you've invested in entrepreneurial businesses, you teach entrepreneurship and innovation, you're an expert in this field, and you're now sharing this knowledge and experience in the book Startup Stories. And I'm particularly excited because you coined an expression called everyday entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. That sounds like it's in the space that I advocate, is that everybody should approach life entrepreneurially, and many, if not most, if not everyone, should become a practicing entrepreneur. So was that your perspective?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, the primary motivation for this book was the disconnect with students who show up to class wanting to be an entrepreneur who makes $1 million a year and be their own boss and work their own hours, which is completely fine, but it's the equivalent of wanting to be a professional athlete. And I think over the years, I've formed this view that really you're asking that sort of level of performance, and but they do this without sort of any training or practice at their craft, but they're constantly hearing the message that anyone can be an entrepreneur. So there's this disconnect of, well, if anyone can be an entrepreneur, where's my $1 million? So when we teach entrepreneurship, it's often very focused on the Silicon Valley model, this notion of that you should be targeting high wealth, high growth businesses that are VC backed technology firms. But the reality is that these are less than 1% of all startups. And so the everyday entrepreneurs that you referred to is everyone else. Basically, there's about 400,000 or 500,000 businesses that start up every month. And what I wanted to do is give students a realistic assessment of the different ways you can be an entrepreneur, both the advantages and the challenges and ways to develop.
But you're trying to be encouraging, right? It's not that you're discouraging. We're just saying, hey, you got to have the right model, but entrepreneurship is a good life and a good goal, and it's a route to purpose and meaning and those kinds of things. So what is the replacement for the Silicon Valley model? Maybe we'll cover that at the end when we've gone through the rest of your book. But what would you replace the Silicon Valley model with as a perspective for these students?
Well, I don't think the Silicon Valley model is wrong per se, but I think that there are other alternatives. And I think by looking at, as you referred to, the different levels of entrepreneurship or the different ways you can practice entrepreneurship, that it opens up more possibilities, that it's not just an either or, either you're Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or you're nothing. And so people can adopt a realistic perspective of where they want to play in the entrepreneurship space.
Well, let's go to the book then. It's a terrific read. I really enjoyed it. You outlined six what you're calling levels of entrepreneurship, and we'll have you explain that. But in each case, you provide interesting and quite intimate real life stories and examples, people that you've interviewed, people you know, and then you support that with research. You draw conclusions. You suggest implications. So it's not only an easy read, but it's beautifully well constructed. So let's start off by defining what you mean by levels of entrepreneurship, and we can start at level one. That seems to make sense. You call that personal entrepreneurship.
Yeah, so level sort of comes from a sports metaphor. And if you think about sports, when I referred to professional athletes earlier, that the Silicon Valley model is very similar to that. It's saying that you want to play for the NBA if you want to be on a Silicon Valley startup. But if we think about basketball as a sport, there's so many different ways you can play basketball. You can have a simple pickup game. You can play for a local league. You can be on the high school team, be on a college team. So, in this sort of sports like metaphor, entrepreneurship is like this too. You can choose the intensity, and as you increase the intensity, you're going to need more preparation, more practice. There's going to be more challenges. So, what I'm doing is encouraging budding entrepreneurs to choose a level that they're comfortable with challenging themselves, that you don't all have to go out and say it's NBA or nothing, that there are ways to ease into this thing and also different places that you can decide to play. It's not NBA or nothing. So a personal entrepreneur in that sense is somebody that's managing their own human capital. They don't necessarily have large investments from others or employees or anything like that. They're just working with what they have themselves.
Well, I love that expression, managing your own human capital. And you talk about doing that over the span of a career or the span of life. When you talk about managing human capital, I think in terms of how much do I invest in it and how do I calculate the return, which is greater than the cost of the investment. Is that the right way to extend that analogy, to think of it as a lifetime of human capital management?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm saying in the book, is that we all own our own human capital. We're all making decisions about education and training and experiences that we're accumulating. And we're doing that for our career particularly early on with our education and training, in the hope that there's going to be a future payoff. And of course, all of those payoffs are uncertain, as we know in an Austrian framework. So it's our best guess of what's going to work for us. And that in itself is the essence of entrepreneurship, making investments with uncertain future payoffs. So in that sense, in the fact that we all control our human capital, we're all entrepreneurs. So what I said earlier about anyone can be an entrepreneur, well, that's true if you frame it as the manager of your own human capital.
Yeah. And we could also take that to, should everyone be an entrepreneur? And it sounds like that would follow, at least look at your life entrepreneurially.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't want to be too prescriptive and tell people how they should run their lives, but we know from research on proactive companies that they tend to outperform reactive companies. So if we can teach people to get ahead of the curve and think about the future and how they're working towards that future, that might be a valuable life skill. So that's something we've done at the university I work at. We've created an entrepreneurial thinking course in the life skills part of our gen ed curriculum. So we sort of believe in that view.
Yeah, life skills. That's another good perspective. You include in this level 1, Steve, career entrepreneurs and then what you call intrapreneurs. And I got the impression also that one can move in and out of those. You can be both at different points in your life. How do you differentiate between those two kinds of personal entrepreneur?
So an entrepreneur is someone who works for a traditional corporation. They're not working in their own business per se, but they're often exhibiting a lot of the traits that you see entrepreneurs performing. So they're innovative, they take risks, they are proactive in trying to improve the organization. So we're seeing, for example, Egon Zehnder reporting that 29% of Fortune 500 companies now have a chief innovation officer. So I also had a similar role at the university in the last few years, looking at new products, markets, partnerships, processes, and technology. So in that sense, it's very Schumpeterian, if your listeners are familiar with Schumpeter as an economist, who said it's about creative destruction and creating new things. Of course, you're not owning the outcome of that, or not exclusively. There's promotion opportunities. There's, you may have some sort of profit sharing in your organization as well. And it's certainly a place to practice those skills that you could take into your own organization. So I don't draw a hard and fast line between having to own your own company to be a real entrepreneur.
Steve Phelan classifies entrepreneurship into 6 levels and gives us 2 examples for each. That's 12 entrepreneurial journeys. That's plenty to choose from. And we can help you design your own journey to a beautiful business with our online course, The Austrian Entrepreneur's Journey, available at e4epod.com/journey. That's the letter E, the number 4, the letter E, pod.com/journey. And now back to our conversation. And the innovation inside a corporation, I think, is obviously it's got that entrepreneurial sense that you just described. Per Byland has this great expression that what you're doing in a corporation as a manager is strengthening that company's value proposition, as opposed to creating a brand new value proposition that didn't exist before. Both of those are entrepreneurial. So that's a worthwhile entrepreneurial pursuit, to strengthen the company's value proposition.
Absolutely.
So let's move to level 2, and you call this the nascent, if that's the right way to pronounce it, entrepreneur. And again, there's 2 kinds in there: embryonic and emerging. So advances to level 2, Steve.
So nasce means to birth something in Latin. And so a nascent entrepreneur is someone that's birthing an organization, if you like. They're going through the process of developing a sustainable business. So I distinguish between, as you said, embryonic and emerging entrepreneurs. Embryonic entrepreneurs are those that are pre-revenue. So there's not yet a product out there in the customer's hands that's generating sales for you. So there's a whole set of challenges associated with that, primarily around customer discovery. How do we bring the product to market that somebody's willing to buy? So as you're aware, there's a lot of steps that are involved in actually getting something that's marketable to an end customer. There's a lot of testing, some prototyping, figuring out exactly the attributes that customers want. So it's a lot of work that you need to do as an embryonic entrepreneur, and this could take days through to years to accomplish that first dollar of revenue, depending on the nature of the industry that you're in. Emerging entrepreneurs, on the other hand, are companies that are post-revenue. The entrepreneur is a company that's post-revenue but pre-profit. So you're getting sales, but your cash flow is negative. And so it's about going from that negative cash flow situation to a positive cash flow so that you have a sustainable business. So the key then is to talk about your business model and to make sure that you're making money on every unit you're selling, to talk about economies of scale, to see how you're going to grow the business in order to improve your margins. So an essential function, but again, somewhat different challenges to an embryonic entrepreneur that's pre-revenue.
So this nascent entrepreneur stage is one I want to get out of, right? I get into it because starting the idea, I'm launching the company, but I want to get mature at some point.
Right.
I deal with a lot of emerging companies in the venture capital business, and that's a real challenge to get to the sustainable business model where the company starts to feel mature, and often you don't get there until there's some kind of liquidity event. You get acquired by somebody else, or you get to a really robust round of capital. So emerging can last for a long time.
That's true, yeah. Years in some cases.
Yeah. Or as maybe companies like Uber are still emerging. They don't have a profitable business model yet.
I think it was Amazon that was 10 years before they made a profit, right?
Right, although that was Bezos' strategy, I think, not to make a profit, at least an accounting profit. He wanted to reinvest all of the money in new capital.
Right, absolutely.
So level 3 is lifestyle entrepreneurs, and there's an interesting new concept you have in there, Steve. You call it craft entrepreneurs. Maybe tell the story that illustrates the craft entrepreneur, and then describe it to us in general.
Yeah, so I think the origins of that go back to medieval times. I think listeners might be familiar with the term guilds or craft guilds, and very much a controlled sort of system where you went through an apprenticeship under a master, and eventually you became a journeyman who was working for others, and before eventually becoming a master craftsman. And I use the masculine here because it was typically men that were involved. And so there was quite a large amount of pride with being a master craftsman. But as industrialization came along, the status of crafts tended to decline. And so to the point where even in the 1960s, people were denigrating people who were craft-based entrepreneurs. So what we mean by that in the book is people who work for themselves, typically have a trade. So the best way to think about it is someone who might have been a plumber working for a plumber and then decides to go out on his or her own, taking their tools, truck and so forth, and starting their own plumbing business. So it turns out this is a very large portion of the self-employed population. And so I think it's not a good idea to denigrate them for what they're doing. I think they serve a very valuable role in the economy, but also to not ignore them when we talk about entrepreneurs. So in that sense, craft entrepreneurs tend to be small. They tend to not employ others. They tend to work on things where they have an expertise and so forth. Today, we're seeing other industries emerge for craft industries, brewing being a classic example right now. So there's a resurgence in sort of respect for craft entrepreneurs, the authenticity that they bring and so forth. The number one reason people give for working for themselves is actually autonomy, so rather than making money. So often craft entrepreneurs are happy to earn the same as they would have earned working for someone else and enjoy the autonomy that comes with being their own boss.
Yeah, I love the illustration through plumbing. I think that's a craft where you're very intimate with serving the customer. The customer, if it's a homeowner or even a business, has typically a problem. You want to solve a plumbing problem of some kind. It's very important to them. Speed is important. effectiveness is important. Doing a beautiful job that looks good is important. And the craft obviously gets better and better the more you practice it, so you can become an expert. I think it's a beautiful illustration.
Mhm. And it's perfectly okay to say that's my goal in life, is to be good at what I do rather than have to run a billion-dollar company.
Yeah. In fact, that's an excellent form of achievement. And then you also include in this level, you call them virtual entrepreneurs. And are those the craft entrepreneurs of the 21st century, Steve, or is that
I think that's a good
shortening the
line to
analogy?
draw, actually, and I didn't think of it that way until you raised that right now. But yeah, I think that they have those virtues of being autonomous, of practicing a craft, which in this case could be organizing electrons and zipping them around the world and coordinating activities at a distance. But definitely that's the 21st century version. I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4EPod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4EPOD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
And I know just from watching my email inbox on the internet, there's tons and tons of advice and models and case histories about how to become really good at being one of those virtual entrepreneurs, how to set up on Amazon or how to set up your supply chain in the Far East. So it sounds like there is a craft in this, and that some people are polishing that craft, and they're sharing best practices and so on. Wouldn't call it a guild yet, but it's that kind of idea.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's certainly an emerging and developing industry that seems to change every year, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
what worked 5 years ago doesn't work today.
So then in your book, Steve, we get to what felt to me, as I read it, kind of a major stepping stone, a major decision point, a major change in organization type and the challenge that the entrepreneur faces. And that's when the entrepreneur becomes an employer. In fact, you call it the employer entrepreneur.
Mhm.
Is that right? Is this a major demarcation point in these levels that you're identifying?
Yeah, so I think if you think about the level of complexity or the level of intensity that I referred to earlier with the sports metaphor, this is taking that next step where you're bringing others into your business. And so you've got all of that extra complexity associated with managing employees, hiring them, the legal implications of that. So what we see in the data is that incorporated entrepreneurs tend to be the ones that are hiring people, and unincorporated entrepreneurs that are just sole traders or partnerships tend to be those craft entrepreneurs, and they don't hire people. So there is that demarcation, as you point out, that as a company gets more sophisticated, it goes to this new legal form of limited liability incorporation. It also starts to take on employees. The complexity of the operation goes up. Outside finance might become a factor as well. So there's just a lot more moving parts.
And is the challenge, Steve, one of what we might call transaction costs? You know, getting the hiring the right people and getting the most out of them from a productivity standpoint and organizing them properly, or is it an HR problem of you know, how do I compensate them? How do I keep them happy from a personal standpoint? Or is it both of those things? What's the challenge in having employees?
Well, I think it's twofold. One is there's a coordination issue of how do I get all of the people on the same page, working together, doing the right things. And then there's a cooperation problem of how do I incentivize people to want to do the right thing. So I may have worked out the puzzle of what they should be doing, but whether they're actually doing it is also a challenge in itself. And that incorporates the compensation, but also your management style how you hire people, and so forth. So in the book, I talk to people who've been very good at managing employees, those who've learned over time to get better at it. And so there's several different hacks that they share about how they have changed the way that they approach managing employees, or what they find is a good practice. So once again, it's something that can be learned over time. Some people are good at it, others become good at it. But it certainly is that shift that you talk about.
And then you make a special case, or at least a separate case, of the family business that might be adding employees, but they're family members. And sometimes as you're growing, they become cousins and second cousins and so on like that. You say that's a special challenge. Tell us about that.
So the positive of employing family members is, of course, you have a lot more flexibility. So even the Bureau of Labor talks about the fact that you can have variable compensation for family members and leave. And so somebody can come in and work for you if you need them on the weekend, or you don't have to bring them in. There's much more informal contracts, if you like, with family members. Clearly, you can trust family members more than you might be able to trust a stranger. So there's some really positive reasons to have family members involved in your business. Of course, the issue then is that you're not just seeing them at work, you're also seeing them at home. So any of the conflicts that might arise within the family can cross over that work-life balance and create additional problems. Notion that you should carry people who are underperforming family members is a common thing that you hear people say. Succession planning about who's going to take over the business, how you make decisions if different family members are involved in the business in different ways, and is it a seniority or age thing? Is it a competence-based thing? So a lot of issues get in the way as you start to run the family business as well. And it's not to say there aren't solutions to those things, but there are some fairly common challenges.
Yeah. Then your next level of business or level of entrepreneurship is when business success occurs. You're talking about growth entrepreneurs managing a growth business. Expansionary is one version, and gazelle is another, which you can explain to us. I got the impression, but I may be wrong, that you're implying that the business starts to lose, or the entrepreneur starts to lose control of the business. Not lose control, but hey, it's growing so fast. There's more than the entrepreneur can cope with, and they have to loosen the reins a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, in all things, as the organization gets larger, then the distance increases between the CEO and everybody else in the organization. You start to have departments and levels of control and so forth as you get larger. So this is very much a decision point for the entrepreneur. Certainly not all businesses want to grow, and they don't want to be larger. So I talk about a case in the book of a CEO who decided to actually downsize the number of locations in the business because he didn't want to lose control and wanted to have more control over the operations. But expansionary entrepreneurs are people who are looking for managed growth. They're not necessarily shooting for the moon to grow as quickly as possible. They're going to add locations. Often they're self-funded, so it takes longer to add different parts of the business. But as a result, they own more of the equity. They have more control of the company. Gazelle entrepreneurs, on the other hand, that you typically see in Silicon Valley, and the ones that you would fund in your VC operations, are trying to expand very rapidly. Often that's because they're in winner-take-all markets where they're using outside funding to supercharge their growth so that they can dominate a particular market and get the greatest market share. So not all strategies apply to all types of entrepreneurs, and different industries will have different proportions of these growth strategies. But the majority of entrepreneurs outside the tech sector are doing this carefully slow expansion of the expansionary entrepreneur.
We see with a lot of the high growth businesses that partially because of managerial reasons, partially because of competitive and market reasons, it's really hard to sustain those high rates of growth. And as you imply, it may be better not to get into that hyper growth phase and try and keep it much more controlled.
yeah, there are certainly advocates who argue that you shouldn't sell out to venture capitalists, and you should keep your business under your own control. But once again, it's just a function of what you want out of life and why you're doing all this.
Yeah, I sometimes think, though, that some entrepreneurs who get into the venture capital area, being receivers of venture capital, don't always understand the implications of it.
Right.
It's certainly possible that the venture capitalists can take your business in places you don't want to go.
Yeah, I've been teaching entrepreneurial finance this year, and that's always a surprise to the students how all that works and what's embedded in term sheets and control
Right,
issues. So,
right, exactly. And then there's another section of your book. I'm not sure whether it's a level that tells about maverick entrepreneurs and hero entrepreneurs, and I classified that as the intersection of idiosyncratic individual behavior and public perceptions of entrepreneurship. But I'm sure you have a better way to describe it. What are mavericks and what are heroes?
so this level is about the super entrepreneurs, the ones that have made it, so to speak, that have got through this hyper growth phase, and then they're the ones we see in the news all the time, the billionaires or the mavericks that are the Elon Musks that are flouting convention and so forth, the Steve Jobses of the world. And so this is what people typically associate with highly successful entrepreneurs. So in the Maverick chapter, I'm asking the question, do you need to be different to be a super entrepreneur? Do you need to be this massively out of the box thinker? Is there something different about these highly successful entrepreneurs? Now, people like Gary Vaynerchuk say that entrepreneurs are born, not made, that you can't teach somebody to act in this super entrepreneurial way. You either have it or you don't. And certainly that has a following. In fact, another of the reasons I wrote this book was being at a conference where there were a lot of super entrepreneurs. And I asked them this question. There was a panel of entrepreneurs. And I said, do you think I can teach someone to be an entrepreneur? And basically everyone on the panel said no. So among the very successful, there tends to be a view that there's a certain je ne sais quoi that you have, something that you have that can't be taught. So this is very interesting. Is there this barrier to becoming a super entrepreneur? So I go through in this Maverick chapter to look at the evidence. There is actually some research that indicates there might be a genetic component to somebody becoming an entrepreneur. Personality research has shown mixed results, but I think part of that is because they're looking at different types of entrepreneurs in the research. But quite possibly there could be a mixture of both luck and personality and genes and the particular context that you're finding yourself in that accounts for super success, maybe as much as 50% of the outcome. Gary Vaynerchuk says that you just really need to do the work, and that talent's going to determine where you end up. But the reality is context is also important. There's not a lot of internet billionaires coming out of Bangladesh or Afghanistan. So where you're born is obviously a very critical factor. And a lot of people don't actually do the work. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I'm of the point of view that entrepreneurship is behavior, it's action. I think that's what, when we talk about judgment is action. And therefore, if it's behavior, it can be learned. And you learn by acting. They sometimes call it trial and error, but acting and learning is probably a better perspective. So I'm a big fan that you can learn to be an entrepreneur. You used an interesting term, which is talent. And in the Gallup survey about entrepreneurial strengths, they talk about talent as a mixture of personality attributes and active behavior. So, as you say, it's probably a blend.
Mm-hmm.
You used the Elizabeth Holmes example as was she a maverick or a hero?
Well, she was a very big hero at one stage until there was some impropriety uncovered with her operation. And one of the things that I do in the super entrepreneurship section, particularly in the hero entrepreneurship section, is contrast Elizabeth Holmes with someone like Bill Gates and point out that both of them basically peddled in vaporware early on in their career. And so maybe Bill got lucky and Elizabeth didn't. And so Elizabeth's now facing possible jail term for fraud by claiming that her device did all of these things that it ultimately didn't do. But Bill was also claiming a lot of software things that Microsoft could do that he didn't actually have at the time he made the claims. So there's a fine line, I guess, between being a hero and a failure in this world.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the vaporware days of Microsoft. I think Bill was guilty of saying it would do what he claimed it would do. He was just exaggerating when it would be ready, whereas Elizabeth said her machine would do something that it actually couldn't do.
Well, he actually told IBM he had an operating system for their PC when he didn't have one. So he went out and bought one later on, then made some adjustments. So, there's certainly some gray area there.
Yeah, no doubt. So we've got these levels. There's one more, but we'll leave it for a second. Are there commonalities here, Stephen? I think in terms of business model, and I hope all the successful entrepreneurs in all of your levels put the customer first, and they understand subjective value, even if they can't articulate that, and they know how to be flexible in the use of capital. What did you find in commonalities between the levels?
Well, one thing I think is at the bedrock, and because these are levels, I think each level builds on itself. So some of the things that people have at lower levels, of course, are also traits of people at higher levels. So one of the bedrock things I think is personal responsibility, that to have that attitude of if I don't do it, who? And just taking that responsibility to take ownership of making things happen. And I you say you're a big proponent of action. So responsibility and action go hand in hand. And I also find that entrepreneurs are also very proactive relative to the general population. So they see an opportunity to make an improvement, and then they go and do it, and instead of talking about it. So there are a couple of things I think that are really common across all entrepreneurs that I meet.
Good. There's one more section in the book that we'll cover quickly because you and I have talked about it on the podcast before, but that's the prospect in the future of whether AI can be an entrepreneur. And let's summarize that quickly for our listeners.
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, AI is a set of tools that entrepreneurs can use and exploit, so they can often search through things and execute actions faster than humans can. Think about stock market trading, for example. They can execute trades at the speed of light almost. But ultimately, at the end of the day, somebody's making decisions about which AI to use, which rules, how much to invest, and so forth. Put rules around how the AI works. And so AI is really good with working with existing categories. It's not so good at inventing new categories and new ways of doing things, innovating, in other words, true innovation. It's not human. It can't empathize about human needs. Often humans have to tell it what's important. So there's a role there for entrepreneurs to prioritize human needs in a way that a machine might have great trouble doing. And it has no concept of risk in a machine, or existential risk. A machine can be powered off and the machine doesn't care if it's on or off. So without that, it has no idea of is this a good thing or a bad thing to do from a long-term survival sense. So it's not saying that AI could never get to this point, something that's known as artificial general intelligence, where it has this more human-like sensibility. But right now, the sort of AIs that are setting the world aflame and abuzz are not of that nature. And so I don't see AI replacing entrepreneurs anytime soon for those higher level activities.
But every entrepreneur should be knowledgeable about AI and how it can be applied to their business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a tool, just like having a horse was a tool back in the 19th century. You should use all the tools that you have at your fingertips.
Well, let's see if we can wrap all of this up thematically, Steve. We at Economics for Entrepreneurs, we're fans of the entrepreneurial life at any level. We say it's a life of purpose and meaning. So purpose is the action part, that every human being is purposeful. They're trying to achieve an end, and entrepreneurship is very much a purposeful activity, but also that it has meaning. that I get the feeling that there is the possibilities of achievement. I can make a difference. It gives meaning to my life. I've heard that referred to in an academic terminology as existential agency, i.e., it's important to my existence that I can act and feel like I'm going to achieve something. You talk to a lot of actual entrepreneurs in every one of your levels. Um, can you give this a little bit more kind of human depth and reality as opposed to the abstractions of purpose and meaning? What did you find about people in your studies?
Sure. I think the first point is that people are drawn to self employment for a wide variety of reasons. There's certainly a group that does it out of necessity, that maybe they don't have a lot of choices open to them. We see this in developing countries, or for people who are immigrants who maybe have their credentials not recognized in their new country, and so they go to fringes of society where credentials aren't required. But profit is certainly a motive. Autonomy, we've talked about, and some researchers even saying people do things impulsively. They might start a business on an impulse, seem like a good idea at the time. So, all that being said, I think I certainly take the view that entrepreneurs should feel prouder that they're providing a social service that meets customer needs. And I don't think this false dichotomy that happens between non-profits that are doing some sort of noble activity versus the dirty profit-seeking sector. I think that's denigrating entrepreneurs unnecessarily. And I think as a group, we in business should step up and constantly remind people that we're providing a service and meeting customer needs, and often doing it in far superior ways than may have been done at an earlier time. So innovation is a noble calling. Providing for customers, meeting needs is a noble calling. And that being said, I also think there's a dark side of entrepreneurship, something that Ballmer called unproductive entrepreneurship, where entrepreneurs are not improving social welfare and may even perhaps be destroying it. So some in the field have argued that unproductive entrepreneurs are not real entrepreneurs, but I think from our conversation to date, I have trouble drawing these lines between real and not real entrepreneurs. It's certainly a facet of what goes on, and I think it's something that we need to confront as well. And society as a whole has to ask the question, how can we create more productive entrepreneurs that are contributing to social welfare, and create institutions that disincentivize the unproductive side?
Yeah, we strongly believe here, and I think you do too, that there's an ethic of entrepreneurship. It starts with serving others. That gets captured sometimes as consumer sovereignty. The consumer's the boss. But underlying that is the idea of, for me to make a profit, I've got to serve somebody in a way that they need and the way that they are valuable. I got to do it ethically, and that's the essence of entrepreneurship. So I'm not. I don't buy the Baumol the Baumol analysis. But just one last point about, use the term self-employment, and I have a little reaction against that. You kind of feel that employment is giving up some rights. I'll go work for somebody who will employ me, and I've got to clock in and clock out and conform with whatever the employer tells me to conform to. So therefore, self-employment doesn't sound like the right term for me. But the idea of responsibility and managing my human capital for my lifetime, that does appeal. So do you have any thoughts about how we can express this idea of responsibly managing my human capital for my lifetime?
Yeah, I think that's really the essence. And I think people move in and out of self-employment and employment with others. They can have different ventures running at the same time. People can choose to take time off to go to study. They can have family to take care of and meet family needs. And so all of that, if you're making a conscious decision about that and you're consciously investing how you spend your time, I think is an entrepreneurial act, absolutely. And you're doing it in the hope that there's going to be a payoff to you in the future of those sort of activities. So I would not malign people that are making all sorts of different choices as long as they're doing it in this proactive, responsible way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great perspective, that we're managing our human capital for our lifetime. Entrepreneurship is one way to do it, but there are others. As you say, you might come in and out. We might combine different activities. Different people in a family might take different roles, and the family benefits from both. So that's a great perspective. This book is terrific. It's very inexpensive on Amazon. We'll link to it on our notes site, but I recommend to anybody anywhere on the entrepreneurial journey, whether you're starting, you're in the middle, or you're maturing a company, read this book, because it's very informative and it's very inspiring. So, Steve, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you again, Hunter.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.